Hi and welcome. Today we're honored to welcome Dr. Natalie Fabert, a clinician, researcher, and educator who specializes in the psychology of high control groups and coercive systems. She is speaking with us as a representative of the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion, which is directed by Dr. Janja Lalich. Dr. Fabert volunteers for the center as a member of the board of directors and also directs the continuing education program there for clinicians. Dr. Fabert is an associate teaching professor of psychology at Arizona State University. She's also a licensed psychologist in private practice, where she specializes in working with survivors of cultic abuse, spiritual and religious abuse. Natalie has completed a master's degree in counselor education and a PhD in counseling psychology. Cult survivors are often asked some basic questions by the larger society. Questions like, how do people get sucked into these places? Why don't they just leave? Why didn't someone call the authorities? Dr. Fabert is going to help answer those questions and more today. The Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion is one of the leading organizations dedicated to understanding undue influence and supporting survivors. Right now, the Lalich Center is deeply focused on an urgent and overlooked need: training therapists to competently treat cultic abuse and coercive control trauma. Many survivors struggle to find clinicians who understand the dynamics of thought reform, identity erosion, and long-term complex trauma. Dr. Fabert and the Lalich Center have been working to close this gap, helping therapists build the knowledge and tools needed to offer informed and effective care. So in today's conversation, Dr. Fabert will guide us through the foundations of cult psychology, why these systems are so powerful, and what the recovery process truly involves. We'll explore mechanisms of control, the challenges of leaving, and the experiences of people who still have family inside after they've walked away. This episode is meant to empower and educate, to give language, validation, and clarity. I'm your host, Bonnie Zampino, and this is The Cult on the Cape. Dr. Fabert, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bonnie. What a wonderful introduction, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm very moved by what you have put together here, along with some of the other survivors that you've been interviewing. It's very moving, and thank you so much for reaching out to the Lalich Center and to talk with us about some of the services we offer and some of what we're up to recently to help with these really important issues.
It is really important, and I'm personally really gratified by your recent focus on training therapists, because it is really challenging to find therapists who really understand coercive control and cult and religious abuse. I think most survivors, if you talk to us, we've found therapists who were just fascinated and they wanted to know more, but that wasn't really why we were there. So I know later in the conversation, we're going to get some tips from you on how survivors can kind of advocate, with their therapists to help point them in that direction of training.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry to say that your experience of having a therapist be fascinated to hear more the salacious details is something that we have heard often, because sometimes in these systems it is so shocking what goes on, and it's just confounding. And I think, yes, that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the Lalich Center, is to really educate clinicians about cults and coercion, because therapists do have a lot of knowledge about a lot of the different components of what goes on, and how to work with clients who present with some of the mental health symptoms, but having a better understanding of cults is really essential, and it's not something that's part of the normal training package of becoming a therapist, unfortunately. So we're in desperate need of educating clinicians on this really important topic so that people don't have that experience anymore when they find a therapist.
Yeah, we're so grateful that you're working on that. But to kind of go back to basics,
Mhm.
last week we talked to a resident of Cape Cod, just a regular townsperson, who in her professional life worked with many members of the Community of Jesus, which is a high control coercive group in Orleans, Massachusetts. And in that conversation, she was describing like when she first met members, she was, struck by how happy they seemed and how accomplished they were. But that as her work with them continued, they started to express frustration and sadness about things that were happening in their lives and their work and the things that they were being required to do by the leadership, which, they believe is spoken to directly by God. And she just was like, I can't
Mhm.
understand it. And
Mhm.
so kind of just starting there, because I think a lot of
Yeah,
people just can't understand it. How do you define a cult or
yeah,
a high control group? And like what differentiates them from like, normal church or community organization?
sure. Sure. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of cults and what they really are, and even a lot of dialogue and debate about the right terminology to use to describe these types of social systems. A cult, in when I use the term cult, people have different definitions of what, different meanings when they use this term. But what I mean is a group or a movement in which there's excessive devotion to a person and or an idea, and also in which there is social manipulation that's sort of to some degree systematic and coercive control that takes place over the course of time that in almost all cases leads to manipulation and abuse. So that's a cult. Cults are power structures, they're social systems, they're power structures, and all cases there's different dimensions, including the charismatic authority
Mhm.
that's present, in which there's authority figure that has some kind of charisma that almost hard to understand binds the members to the leader or the leadership. And there's also, if not religious necessarily in nature, some type of transcendent ideology that tries to explain everything, all of existence. It
Yeah.
doesn't, again, necessarily need to be religious. And then there are different systems of control, and those systems of control can be explicit rules about what you can or can't do, or they could also be implicit systems of control about maybe it's not written down or explicitly stated, but sort of rules that everybody just intuitively knows about how they're supposed to behave.
Yeah.
And it's really important for people to understand that cults are not necessarily all religious. That's a myth. There are secular commercial cults. So there can be even one-on-one cults, family cults. There can be political movements that are very cult-like, if not cults, what we would consider cults. So it doesn't have to do with religion, although there is always some sort of ideology that's adhered to almost in a religious way, but it doesn't necessarily need to be religious in nature. Sometimes people like to use the term new religious movements as an alternative because it's less, negative or whatever. But cults are not all new and they're not all religious. And if it meets the definition that I use, then it is something that's negative because it's manipulating and abusing and
Yeah.
exploiting folks, or it at least has nothing in place to stop that from happening. because of the nature of the power structure that's involved. And these are sort of closed systems. The characteristics of cults in all cases lead to sort of this, what Janja Lalich calls a bounded choice for members, in which they might be making decisions that seem completely irrational to people outside of the group. But if you've been part of that system for a long time, it actually is the only choice you have. So
Yeah.
there's an illusion of choice. It looks like you're making these terrible choices, but you really don't have any other choice.
Yes.
And these systems create sort of this circular logic where the leader is always right.
Yes.
And why is the leader right? Because they're the leader,
Yep.
right? Or they're the God, whether it's something like God is actually speaking through them, which of course is on the more extreme end when members really truly believe that God is speaking through them. So whatever it is that they do, it must be good, even if it feels bad.
Yeah.
Or even if there's a bad outcome, it's unfalsifiable, right?
Yeah.
So the leader is always going to be right or good or moral, no matter the outcome. And there's always sort of a way to justify the leader's decision, even if they change their mind. I mean, whatever it is, even if their prophecies don't come true, there's this sort of circular logic that happens in these systems where there's just nothing that you can do to see there's nothing that they could do wrong,
Yeah.
kind of a thing. And so in all cases, whether that's because they speak through God or whether, again, it's like a secular cult and there's just other types of logic in place that leads people to believe that the leader or the leadership or the group, the movement is never wrong. They can't be wrong. so so
How
that's
in the
something that we see
world,
in all these systems. What's that?
how how do people, like
Uh-huh.
regular people,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes highly educated people, wealthy
Yeah.
people, get involved in these groups? And not, I mean, I'm interested like how they're recruited, but
Mm-hmm.
also how do educated, intelligent
Yeah.
people get to a point where they really believe that the leadership is infallible? Like how
Right.
does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, right? And that's kind of something that there's a lot of different angles here, but you're asking a bunch of different questions. So the first question you're asking is like, what is the pathway to membership into a group like this?
Yep.
You're asking sort of what is there, maybe you're not asking this, but a lot of questions we get, or a lot of the myths about cult members is that there's like a certain personality profile of a cult member, or that you're asking sort of, yeah, the process of recruitment. And then you're asking about sort of how they end up behaving in the way they do. How can this happen? And how can smart, intelligent people get recruited into a cult? And I will sort of just back up to talk about pathways of recruitment. And I
Okay.
think it's really important for people to know, we have this idea of like a young adult, naive woman going into the world and sort of like seeking out some place to belong. And that's a seeker, if you will. And that's certainly one pathway to getting involved in these types of organizations. But I think it's important for people to know that there are people who are like some of your guests on your podcast who are born into these systems.
Yeah.
And when you are born into a cultic system, that's all you know.
Hmm.
And humans are designed to adapt to whatever social environment we're born into. So that's the way that we adapt. That's just the way that we are biologically driven to socially adapt to our environments, not just adapt to the behaviors and the traditions and the culture in terms of just what the norms are, but even adapt to the way of thinking and the way of believing and worldviews and all of those things.
Yeah.
So that is overdetermined, right? That if you're born into a group, that it's something that is just how you were raised, and you don't know necessarily any different. Although I will say, a lot of people, a lot of children do intuitively know from a very early age that something seems wrong and seems off, and they do have that sense within themselves that this isn't right, you know,
Yes.
or this doesn't make sense to me. And then another way that people get recruited into cultic systems is really through friends and family. That's one of the number one ways that people, it's not like people are going out looking for a cult leader, or they like, you know, that it's not even
Right.
like they necessarily find the cult leader initially very charismatic, but they might, usually it's a group, you know, it could be a multi-level marketing cult, it could be a religious cult, again, it could be a yoga cult, a therapy cult, you know, there are all sorts of different types of cults.
Right.
And usually it's a friend, a trusted friend or family member who who is like, hey, come do this cool thing. And you might have that idea that, you know, only naive, stupid people like, get into cults, or, and I know that my friend or my family member is not that way. They're smart.
Right.
They want the best for me. So
Yeah.
that doesn't match my stereotype of a cult member. And so this must not be a cult, you know, kind of a
Yep.
thing.
Yep.
Why, of course, this must be a good thing. They're smart. They know what they're talking about. If they think the leader's great, they must be great, you know, kind of a thing. So we trust the people that we love, right? So that's another common way. Members are not, or people who become members are not necessarily naive. There's actually some research that they're higher intelligence, you know, that they have generally high in intelligence.
Wow.
And yeah, and so it's just not true that they're necessarily naive or even necessarily broken. It's like, you know, this idea that people are psychologically broken. A lot of
Yeah.
people are confident. It just depends, you know, a lot of times on who gets targeted. Cults will target people that they want to be a part of their group. If they have something that the leader or the cult needs, some skill, it could just be a
Yep.
skill, like we need an architect, right? You know, or we need somebody who has a lot of money, access to a lot of money, or of
Yep.
course somebody that the cult leader is attracted to, or it could be somebody that they just think this will be an easy person to control and get to do what we want to do. I mean, cult leaders are attracted to the same type of people that any organization would want to have. You know, sometimes they want charismatic, confident people because they know that that's the type of person who would attract more people. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
you know, the same type of person that any kind of like apply to a job, they're looking for smart people who work hard.
Yep.
And so do cults. They want people who are even good to get along well with people, all of those things. It just depends.
Hmm.
And there has to be a match between the sort of at least outward belief system, outward goals of the cultic organization, and the prospective member. We're not all like going to be attracted or vulnerable to the same type of abusive systems. There has to be that initial match between like the way we see the world, what we want for ourselves, what our needs are, and what the cult is offering.
You
Yeah.
know,
Mm-hmm.
truly, I don't, it just, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. And I love that you shared that, it's not necessarily broken, stupid people. It's not necessarily, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere and I belong here, although that happens. But it sounds
Sure.
like there's a variety of reasons and ways that that comes about. So you have a person who has a trusted family member or friend who's
Mhm.
bringing someone along to do a cool thing. They
Mhm.
are kind of attracted to the outward ideology, and so they start coming around more or whatever. How do cults get that person to start to believe and support the asks that become
Yeah.
more demanding, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And, you know, there are different techniques that are used and there are different lenses to look at this. And so we could talk about it forever. We have
Yep.
classes on it. You could take our class
Yay.
to learn more about it. But it starts off with a good thing, right? So you're getting some kind of need met. Now, if you were born into the cult, you're not necessarily, they're not worried, they're not trying to love bomb you. They're not trying to like convince you as why you should be here. They don't have to do that phase of
Right.
recruitment, right?
Yeah,
Which is like
true.
they don't need to use any propaganda on you or anything. Like you're kind of stuck there. And so that's one reason why you kind of, as children, perhaps you don't necessarily see what's so great about it. Like they didn't have
Absolutely.
to love bomb you, right? You're just stuck there.
You're there.
So I want to really say that because I think the experiences of folks who are born into these systems are not always the same as
Yeah.
the experiences of people who were recruited later in life
Yes.
as adults or as young adults. But yeah, it starts off usually with carrots, right? Love bombing, community, anything that you're looking for in your life or in a group that you would typically end up finding and it not necessarily needing to be a cultic group is something that they're going to offer to you. So I think it's important for people. I think a lot of documentaries and things like that and podcasts, they emphasize of what we see at the later stages,
Hmm.
where these, you know, horrible, abusive, or like just really weird behaviors are happening, or everybody's dressing the same and cuts their hair, you know, like, and they're branding themselves with the initials of the cult leader, or they're doing something that like is extreme behavior. And people kind of want to rush to how did that happen? But the more interesting thing to me is how is the more beginning stages or like kind of what it looks like. And to outsiders, I think it's also important to know that there are usually different levels, even within a cultic
Hmm.
organization. So not everybody has the same experience. And that's not just true. That's true according to like how long you've been around, but also like where you're positioned within the group.
Yes.
So in some of these organizations, there might, for people who are more on the periphery of the group, they might have a totally fine experience,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yes.
just get kind of the good stuff, you know, and they have no idea the abuse and the exploitation taking place as you get kind of closer to the circle of the sun.
Yes. We hear
So
that quite a bit.
yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah,
maybe people recruited for the band, but they aren't part of the community. You know, they have great friendships and go on trips and do great things and kind of see some things that are weird, but
yeah,
they're not really in the mix. So,
exactly.
and yeah, I agree. Like, there's got to be a buildup, right? Like, you don't just go from like, oh, I'm going to go to this cool thing with my friend to all of a sudden, you know, doing whatever the thing is that's
Right.
horrible. And I was talking to a survivor the other day who talked about that early time and
Mhm.
had a friend and they would go over and have meal on Sunday and lay on the couch and watch football. And it just felt like a really nice family, you know, kind of place
Mhm.
to hang out until she moved in. And then there was
Right.
no more being on the couch watching football. So that build up to being like fully immersed
Right.
is fascinating, like how
Yes.
that happens.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And that's where we see the metaphor of, when you talk to kind of any cult recovery specialist or people in this field, like we like to sort of talk about the metaphor of the frog in a boiling pot,
Yes. Yeah.
where you find like you're a frog and you're about to dry out and you need a refresh, and you find this really comfortable little puddle. You think it's just a puddle of water that's lukewarm or cold, cool. And then the heat is very, 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 very slowly turned up, and you
Mhm.
don't even notice that you're boiling. And maybe you're afraid to jump out because don't think you're gonna find another refreshing pot of water again, and
Yeah.
you don't even notice, right?
That's a
You know,
beautiful analogy.
yeah. So that's one part of what's happening, that there's the abuse becomes you become habituated slowly to the abuse that's taking place before you even notice how bad it is. But there's a lot of the process of coercive control is kind of taking place over time. So
Can you
there's,
explain that? Like
yeah,
the process of coercive control and, thought reform, identity erosion, that whole piece. These are like huge words, and like, what does that
yes,
like?
yes. Well, there's a lot of, we could talk about this for a very long time. I could talk to you about, I teach a class called the social psychology of cults. And I think the
Wow.
field of social psychology is really, really helps to break this down. The field of social psychology helped us to understand obedience and conformity and groupthink and all of these things, helped us to sort of, this whole field was inspired by the Holocaust. How could people do this horrific, how could people be made to obey such horrific
Yeah.
orders? So I pull a lot of the social psychology literature when understanding how this could happen. The subfields of social psychology, understanding social cognition, understanding self-concept,
Hmm.
and group relationships. All of that literature is really applicable to understanding coercive control and the boiling pot, the frog in the boiling pot, and how that could occur, how smart people and anybody could be affected by this.
Just
I want to talk about, and this is sort of both like a description or a description of, ideological totalism, the eight deadly sins of ideological totalism that Robert Lifton came up with, who he recently passed away. He studied how, prisoners of war could be, we don't really use the term anymore because it's been used, well, for a lot of different reasons, but how prisoners of war could be sort of brainwashed to sympathize with the torturer. But it kind of is a description, but also a bit of an explanation of how things could happen. So what he talked about is the eight deadly sins of ideological totalism again. The first sin is milieu control, which is control of communication.
hmm
This is control of communication with others as well as internal dialogue.
Yeah.
So they people are taught to basically polarize the real, which is the prevailing ideology of the group, and the unreal quote, which is everything else.
Yep.
And there becomes this like personal closure. It kind of, in a sense, frees you from existential doubts or questions about the nature of
Yep.
the world,
Yep.
right? Which is kind of
Absolutely.
freeing to not have to think anymore and to feel
Yeah.
like you have this totalist explanation of everything.
Yeah.
But it also closes yourself off not only from people outside or ideas outside the group, but also to your own thinking when you have doubts,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
you're not allowed, you are basically groomed to be afraid of your own thoughts if those thoughts are doubting.
Absolutely.
So you eventually are basically gaslighting yourself in these systems, right?
Wow.
There's the mystical manipulation, which is some kind of extensive personal manipulations. A lot of times they seem spontaneous or mystical, but they're sometimes planned, or even if they're not planned, they're really just normal human experiences that evoke this like mystical quality. So it could be something as simple as just when we're singing together,
Yes.
that
Yes.
feels great. And that
Yes.
feels like this sense of community and bonding, to actual fake healing sessions, you know what I mean? Like, so it kind of runs the gamut, but in most of these groups, we see almost like these very human, very wonderful human experiences of awe and oneness with the world, oneness with the people that we're with,
Yes.
or just like this idea about, it could be like real experiences, or again, it could be manipulated, mystical experiences that we see in these groups, right? So then you start to attribute, like, it must be the like feeling that I get, this feeling of awe, this feeling of like everything's wonderful. I can only attribute that to the cult leader. And they're telling me that this is because you're in the best group that there is. This is because you're
Yes.
with the smartest person in the world who can do this, or whatever it is.
Yes.
Or it could be sometimes these groups even use, like Keith Raniere's Nexium, they used a certain sort of therapeutic technique that's actually like pretty well known in therapy, but it made it seem like he was the only one, or his folks were the only one that could help you in this way, and then they did something smart here that you can't get anywhere else.
Yep.
Right. So
Yep.
you start to attribute these really like almost magical experiences to the cult leader.
Mm-hmm.
In these groups, there's always a demand for purity.
Oh, yeah.
So, and that doesn't necessarily, so that can be like pure, the way that we think of like purity culture, where it's like sin, like you have to wait till marriage, and sex has to be like between a man and a woman and all of that. Like that certainly is one example of purity, but it could be even the opposite too. Like there are some cults where there's a demand for you to have sex with everyone, and that's expression of God. That's God's expression, right?
Right.
And if you're not doing that, if you're not like showing your love through sex, then in a sense, they don't maybe use this word, but that's like their version of impurity, right?
Right. Right.
Um, so it doesn't necessarily mean purity in the sense of purity culture, but the world is sort of divided into the pure and the impure, or into absolutely good and absolutely evil. And there's some sort of goal that you're expected to always be pursuing in terms of purity that you're never going to achieve, right?
Yes.
You're
Yes.
never going to achieve. And so that's by design. So if you don't achieve it, then there's something wrong with you. There's something shameful about you. And then you're always going to be striving to be better. And you're always going to be under the thumb, because you're always feeling like you're not good enough and you need the cult leader to make you better, right?
Yes.
Or you have something that you need to prove, or you have something that you need to do to be accepted by the group. But the
Yes.
demand for purity is so extreme that you're never going to meet
Never.
it,
Never.
right? And that's by
I mean,
design.
a lot of the survivors that I've spoken with, the purity had to do with even your thoughts. And
Yes,
even if you said, I'm not thinking that, it
yes,
didn't matter. Like then you were in trouble because you weren't,
yes,
accepting this light or truth or whatever
right,
that they're telling you. So like you
right.
you are never ever going to win because
No,
you can be like, in that situation as non-sexual as they come. But even if your outward behavior is completely perfect, they're going to go
yes,
after your
your
mind. And
thoughts.
if
Yes,
you disagree about that, then you're in sin because you're not coming under. So that
exactly.
and it reminds me a lot of like, and I think this a lot, and I have no idea if it's accurate or not, but the cult psychology seems to be so similar to like narcissistic abuse of this
Yes,
love
It
bombing.
is a type of narcissistic abuse.
Yeah, that whole like power and control wheel,
Yeah.
there just seems to be this like similarity between, and it's all control and
Yes.
abuse. So I was just like super curious.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
all control and abuse. It's all a different form of abuse, right? So, there are some different features that make a cult, a group be something that we would refer to, or that I would refer to as a cult. But
Mm.
the coercive control, is the same, whether it's a domestic violence situation or, like you said, the narcissistic abuse in one form or another, whether it's a
Yeah.
family member or political
Yeah.
leader, like whatever it is, it's all a lot of the same features here. And sometimes, depending on like the structure or the size, we
Mm.
tend to have different language for it, different words, but there's a lot of similar social manipulations going on and interpersonal dynamics that are going on. That's absolutely true. Yeah. So, and this kind of gets a little bit to this is sort of goes hand in hand with the demand for purity, which is the cult of confession, which is
Mm.
obsession with personal confession. Is that something that you?
That was the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
The
Yes.
whole premise was
Uh,
living in the light, letting people, particularly leaders, call out your sin, everyone call out your sin publicly and confess, kiss the hand of the person who is doing that to you. Yes, that's crazy that
yes.
you say that.
That is huge. So, I mean, it must be interesting to know that these prisoners of war who are being sort of brainwashed, that's the same technique that's used on them as what it sounds like was used with you.
Mm.
So it's basically sometimes like in cultic sort of therapy or coaching situations, it's the same, or even like sometimes like multi-level marketing groups, you're like confessing to whatever it is that you need to do to make yourself be a better salesperson, even though in reality the structure set up where you're never actually going to make money, right? But it keeps you thinking, keeps you into this self-blame mode. So the cult of confession is something that personal confession, which can be in the right hands very therapeutic, right?
Mhm.
To cathart, to be vulnerable to people. And sometimes even in cultic groups, it can feel really good initially to be catharting and sharing your most innermost darkest demons with people in a group setting. And the in these groups, the more you share, the more vulnerable, the more sort of love bombing you get. And so
Yes.
that feels really good, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
But then it if it's an abusive system, then it's going to be used in an exploitative way, right? And it's
Absolutely.
also at minimum, usually there's not people who are really trained to handle when people get triggered, when people are not necessarily there to really help you to process this in a therapeutic way that's actually good for you. It's
Right.
being used to as a form of control.
Yes.
So in Scientology, it's like all of your confessions are taped, right? So I mean,
Yep.
in the extreme form, and actually not that uncommon in these groups, it's going to be used as blackmail against you,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep. Absolutely.
So that's like the extreme end of cult of confession, but basically it's used in some way to break you down, to make you feel vulnerable, to make you feel just beholden to the group in one form or another. Then there's Lifton calls the sacred science. There's like some kind of aura of sacredness around the basic dogma. There's like whatever that ideology is, it's sort of held as the ultimate moral vision for
Yeah.
how human existence is.
Yeah.
I love talking about multi-level marketing because it's just like gives us a counterexample to the more religious cults, right? So like in a religious group, it's like this is God's word, nothing is above God's word. And I am a prophet, so I speak for God. And so my word is the ultimate word.
Yes.
Or it could be like a sacred science in an MLM where it's like just this idea that if you follow us, you're going to make a lot of money. And if you're not making a lot of money, you're not following us and you're being lazy, or you don't have the skills, whatever it is. And it doesn't, so
Yes.
you're always blamed if
Yes.
you don't reap reward. And if you do make money, which you won't most of the time, then it's because you followed their sacred science. And then there's doctrine over person. This is the subordination of human experience to the claims of the doctrine. Basically, whatever is the doctrine, that matters more than your rights, your freedoms, your well-being, your subjective experience, your preferences, anything like that. And then the dispensing of existence, which is this totalist environment, kind of gets to decide who's a full, real, worthy person and who isn't,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so we see that in different ways. But basically, they get to decide who's good, who's bad, who's evil, who's not, who's deserving of love, who isn't, who even as extreme as like some of the extreme cults, like this idea that we're the only true humans and everyone else is just like a vampire. You know what I mean? Like to the real extreme where it's like a psychosis sounding ideology. And it kind of that's when it gets scary, because that's when your doctrine over person, dispensing of human existence, all of those things can lead you to start to dehumanize the other, anybody who's not following the doctrine or not submitting completely, or not a cult member themselves or part of the cult, then you feel like their lives don't matter as much as yours. And that's when, in the extreme end, things can become kind of violent and that's kind of the ideology that can help it to become violent. So what's coming up for you?
There's so many like thoughts rushing through my head. I mean, part of me is wondering, is that the dehumanizing piece, if it doesn't get, to a violent degree, is that what causes people to disconnect from family that's outside of the group? Or when you're people who are members and they leave family members behind, is that where those relationships are severed?
Yeah, I mean, that can be part of how it happens. I think it depends. So some cultic systems, they use different techniques, right? In all of these groups, there's going to be some degree of isolation
Mhm.
from the outside, as well as from within the group and within yourself, which we'll talk about as well. But in terms of how the process of isolating you from non-cult members, the cults use different strategies for that.
Yeah.
So it could be that you are told that the basic, like, nobody besides this group, and especially this leader, wants what's best for you, and your parents don't actually want what's best for you. And as simple as that. It could be that the ideology says that, like, you're horrible, and if you interact with them, that you're going to hurt them, whatever it is, like,
Oh,
put some
yeah.
kind of phobia into you. It could be that they keep you so busy. A lot of these groups keep you extremely busy doing cult related activities
I
and
was
just
actually
schedule
gonna
you to the nines. Right?
I wanted to actually ask about
Yeah.
that, because I'm so curious, not just about what brings people in, but how these leaders, is there some like
Mhm.
manual somewhere that's like, here's how to run a cult? Because
Right.
so many of the things are so similar, but the one, that we've been focusing on, that was like, there was no time to
Yes.
think, barely time to sleep. Um,
Yes.
Even meals were disrupted by, what were called light sessions, with
Hmm.
like extreme, shaming and discipline and things like that. Is that part of playbook? And What does
Yes,
it do?
absolutely.
Like, what does it do to the
Yeah.
person that's scheduled like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very, very common feature in
Wow.
cultic groups is just engaging you in tasks, taking up all of your time. And it could be quote unquote important tasks. It could be something that's a really menial task, but they have some kind of way of justifying why it's so important that you stay up doing some stupid task, all night long. And so it serves a lot of different purposes. One is certainly, I mean, it could be that they need your labor because they're making money off of you, right? And if they get you feeling like this is your key to heaven by volunteering all of your time or for little or no money, then wow, that's really cheap labor for them and they make a lot of money off of it,
Absolutely.
right? So
Yep.
that's a very, very common thing that we see. And I think in terms of like the human trafficking that takes place often in cults, it's the labor trafficking that we see the most, right?
Yep.
Making
Yeah.
people work for little or no money under some kind of a coercive or some kind of lie or some kind of psychological like coercive control.
And that's
Um,
so
yeah.
frustrating because,
Hmm.
and that was a common theme in
Hmm.
the group that we're focused on. And the general public is like, well, why don't you just not do it? Or,
Hmm.
you know, oh, what's wrong with volunteering?
Hmm.
And it's really hard to explain that there you don't have a choice.
No, no,
And it's really
you
hard to
don't.
explain that because you're like, well,
Right.
they're adults. Why don't they just say no? Well, yeah, you can't. Like bad things will happen to you if you say no.
Yes.
It's
Yes. Absolutely. And so again, it's over the course of time, you've come to know whether it's through explicit fears that you've adopted about what will happen, you're not going to be a good person. I think I read somewhere about this group that obedience is the best, most purest, godly thing that you can do is just obey, just have faith, just give your time. That's how the key to heaven, all of these idea, all of these different, this is how you become self-actualized. This is how you die to yourself so that you can
yes,
become true, or whatever it is. There's some kind of grooming that takes place over the course of time where you come to internalize that you need to just obey, right?
yeah,
In one form or another. Or it could be the more implicit, a lot of these groups, there's the tool and narcissistic systems, everything, the tool of a combination of love and fear, love and
yes,
rejection, love and ostracizing you. So one of the most, the worst things that people can experience, and it's a pain that's unhealthy, is being ostracized
yeah,
by people we love, and especially people who hold power in one way or another over us. And so there can be subtle ways of sort of using, almost in some theories, creating a disorganized attachment between the cult members and the followers. So there's a lot of literature and theories about attachment, emotional attachment that takes place. And
yeah.
I'm sorry, this is so emotional. It sounds like it's really resonating a lot,
Because everything, like, you and I have not talked in any
Yeah.
detail about the group
Yeah.
that I came out of.
No.
So you're talking from an intellectual social psychology. Here's the psychology of cults, and everything you're saying. I'm like I have goosebumps right now. Like
Wow.
everything you're saying is like
Yeah.
right straight out of this particular group, my experience in
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and that's just blows my mind. Like
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
really,
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
because survivors are so busy when they get out trying to figure out how to survive because none of it's
Yes.
at all familiar. We're waiting to go to hell, or become a
Yeah.
prostitute or a drug addict or whatever,
That's
because
what
that's
you've
what
been
they
told.
told
Yep.
us. That, we really didn't have time to process like
No.
any of this stuff. So
Right.
hearing that this is like pretty much how these things go. Like, wow, it's kind of for me that the
Yeah.
first time I'm really hearing and understanding
Mm.
that
Mm-hmm.
this
Yeah.
is this is
Yeah.
the playbook, which is just
Yeah.
crazy.
It can be really eye-opening, and I'm sure very emotional to have somebody who really, I don't know that much about your group or the
Yeah,
experience, to be talking about it like this, if it resonates so much to your experience. And I think, Dr. Yanya Lalich, who is the CEO of the Lalich Center, and she's really the one who's studied cults and written all the main textbooks, and been survived a really abusive cult herself, left by the time she was 40. She started her career as over again, right, and
yes,
became a cult expert, and 40 years later she's really been the one of the main, if not the main, kind of go to people for understanding how this happens. And she always tells a story of how she was describing certain elements of a cult, and somebody, at some seminar or something like that, and somebody came up to her and was like, you're just putting my group down, or something like that. Like, you're just trying to say my group is bad or something. She's like, I've never studied your group. Like, this, I wrote this like before your group even came about. Like, I like, this isn't about your group, but sometimes it is so similar what we see, that
yeah,
it just it's hard for people to understand that there's nothing unique about it. When you look at it from a certain lens, there's
yeah.
really nothing unique about this group compared to other cultic abusive systems.
And that
It might,
is
mm-hmm,
amazing
yeah.
in like a wonderful way, because I think
Mm,
as survivors, the place is scary, and nobody it's hard to imagine that anybody would ever understand anything that we had been through.
mm-hmm,
And these leaders are, wow, what's wrong with them? Which,
yeah,
what's wrong with them? But
exactly.
yeah, I one thing that I think makes me really sad in talking with other survivors, you were talking about attachment and the relationship
Mm-hmm.
failures after people have gotten out, but it's all based on attachment, right? Like
Yes,
how
yes.
how we how we connect to other people, and what we're attracted to, and all of those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It's so that kind of like
mm-hmm.
leads into a bit of when people leave. Is there a kind of a typical progression that triggers someone to start
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it? And
Mm-hmm.
how does
It
that go?
happens in all sorts of different ways. I think, Dr. Lalich talks about and so does a lot of people, talks about sort of this shelf metaphor of, like, something kind of over the course of time, you experience something where it's like, okay, this doesn't match that. Like, you see something that the cult leader does, and that kind of doesn't really check out or whatever, but you you don't want to believe it, right? We haven't talked about a lot of different theories of how this happens, but the theory of cognitive dissonance and how we respond to cognitive dissonance is a really important one to understand this process. But basically, there's this shelf metaphor of, like, it's like, okay, something doesn't sit right for you, you have some kind of a doubt, or you see something, or something doesn't feel good, and you just put that on the shelf. It's like, I'm just gonna just gonna put that over here. Like, I can't deal with that right now. I
Yeah,
can't deal with this idea that maybe I've sold, given over my whole retirement, and I've severed ties with people I love, and I've worked all these many years for somebody who actually doesn't want what's best for me. Like, I can't take that in,
yeah,
right?
yep,
I can't take this. I can't this I have to I have at which you don't want to believe. You
yes,
want to believe that the ideology is true, and that the leader is good, and that this is a good thing, right?
yes, yes,
And that's kind of a social cognitive process that takes place over the course of this coercive control that you're experiencing, where you're the one like you said, and it could be just that you're told that you could be explicit, your thoughts are impure, you have to have good thoughts, you can't have these kind of negative, doubting thoughts, whatever it is.
Yep.
Um, you don't want to, or you have been told to fear any thoughts that are against the cult, the
Yeah.
purity of the cult or the goodness of the cult. And so you have to start putting what you see that's discrepant on a shelf, and eventually it could just be a little thing, but it finally the shelf breaks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it could seem like, people will look back and they're like, oh well, when I learned that, this little thing was a lie, that's when I left. Like, well, that doesn't make sense. What about when you learned that this other thing was a lie? And what about when you saw this? And what it's like, well, for whatever reason, we don't really know, that was like what broke the shelf, right?
Yeah.
So that's like one process, but not everybody leaves. There are people who don't believe in the ideology, or like know that they're in a cult, or at least understand, like don't actually believe in the system years before they actually leave the system. And so
Mm-hmm.
they could just be in the system because they have their kids, they have, like, they don't feel like they have skills to survive outside the cult, whatever it is. It could
Yes.
be people who have sort of emotionally left and cognitively, intellectually left, but they're still in the group. Or
Yep.
the opposite could happen, where there's some other reason that they leave. Maybe they get kicked out. People do
Yep.
get kicked out of cults,
Yes, they do.
if they threaten the leader, if they don't have something, if they're just a drain, they don't produce, whatever is the reason. Sometimes they get kicked out, or they're trying to show a lesson to the other members, and
Yep.
maybe they still believe in the ideology. Or sometimes maybe the leader goes to jail, and everybody, and so there is no actual group, but people are still believing the doctrine, and they still think that, like, the cult leader is the smartest person or whatever, wants their best interest. So it's different for everybody. There's no one universal experience, but there are some similar experiences that people share, for sure.
And when people do leave, and
Hmm.
let's say it doesn't really matter if they still think the place is great or not,
Hmm.
are there things that the larger community, but people that may come in contact with them, are there things that these ex-members need from from us? Is there a certain kind
Hmm.
of understanding or support, or ask questions, don't ask
Hmm.
questions, any wisdom? Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Speaking as an ex-member, when other ex-members start to leave and they're in their, like, initial leaving stage,
Yeah.
is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so like,
Yeah.
they may need to get an apartment, so then they
Yeah.
start meeting new
Right.
neighbors, and
Right.
um like how just
Yeah.
the
It just
general.
depends, right? It just depends on where they're at. I mean, I think you bring up a really, really good point, that a lot of people, when they leave high control situations, I think, kind of maybe stepping back a minute to talk about coercive control. When it comes to coercive control, when it comes to any kind of human trafficking, there's typically, like, from one theory, sort of, or one way of form of language that we give to this phenomenon. There's these different stages that take place. And the first is, whether it's in a cultic environment or some other form of coercive controlling dynamic, there's the stage of identifying the target. There's the stage of grooming, which
Mm,
can be, again, the love bombing, and also sort of the long process, or sometimes shorter process, that takes place of breaking you down, breaking down your psyche, going from a confident person to doubting yourself all the time, grooming you to believe that the leader wants what's best for you. There's that's the whole sort of social psychology that we can't get into completely in this podcast. And then the isolation that takes place, that's isolation from not just outside members, that can be isolation from within the group as
yeah.
well. So
Yeah.
even though you might be with each other all the time, you're not necessarily like, you can still be together, but feel isolated from each other because you're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to necessarily be your true selves. You're not allowed to say what you're thinking. You're not allowed to, a lot of times in these groups, pitted against each other. Intentionally pitted against each other or isolated from kind of knowing what's going on in other parts of the group. And
Hmm.
sometimes in extreme cases, and I'm very sorry to say that this is not that uncommon in cults, even if your family is all in the cult, you're often torn apart even physically from each other, which is one of, and some of the stories on your podcast are just heartbreaking
Yeah.
about being made to have your children, be raised by other cult members.
Yep.
And I'm very sad to say that happens a lot because the cult members don't want you to have close relationships with anybody besides, they don't want you to feel supported by each other because then you would have more power, right?
Yeah.
So, and then the isolation again from your own mind and your own self and your own ability to accept what's happening in your own system, like
Yeah.
accept your own emotions. And a lot of these groups, only certain emotions are allowed, and others are sort of, you're not allowed to even have preferences necessarily. You're not allowed to have longing or negative feelings towards the leader, sadness, all of these things. So your emotional experience is censored, your
Yeah.
thoughts are censored, so you're dissociated from your actual being and you're
Yeah.
isolated from yourself. So that's a third stage of coercive control. And then eventually there's control by any means necessary.
Hmm.
So it moves from just the psychological control to, we're going to make sure that even if you start to sort of quote unquote see the light or get sick of this abuse,
Hmm.
you are controlled in any way necessary, right?
Yeah.
So if that's, we're gonna, we've tricked you into electing us into our government, and now we're gonna, into your government, now we're going to erode all aspects of democracy, so you have no choice and your vote doesn't matter anymore. We are going to make sure that you can't leave. We're going to sue you out of oblivion if you try to say
Yes.
something negative about us. We're
Yes.
going to control your children, make sure your children are completely dependent on us. We're going to, make sure you don't have education, you don't have the skills that you need to leave, or we're going to even threaten your life,
Yes.
so that's at the extreme end of sort of control by any means necessary. It depending on how, depending on how extreme people have come and, the people's experiences are along this continuum when they leave, you bring up a very good point that a lot of people, they might have been working, doing highly skilled things for many years, but don't have anything actually on their resume to speak of. They'd never had an official job. They might have been
Yep.
doing something amazing. They might have not been able to go to college, and they, all of their supports, they gave over all of their money, all of their inheritance to the
Yeah.
group. So a lot of people, they are destitute, right?
Yes.
When they leave these groups.
Yes.
So a lot of the initial, depending on the situation, some other people work really hard to get themselves, might be able to secretly get themselves into a better situation so that they have more when they leave. But a lot of people do just need really, really basic stuff when they leave. And so that's why there are different organizations that try to help support people with just the basics of life, the basics of living. And so I think sort of, you're not going to be able to, when somebody leaves a group, they're not going to, like, healing is going to be a process, and the first step is usually just stabilization and security and the Maslow's hierarchy of
Yeah.
needs
I was just gonna say that.
kind
Yeah.
of kind of a thing: food, shelter, a job,
Yeah.
security, being able to get a good night's sleep, you know,
Yes.
all of that stuff, exercise, like just the basics. And I think like the more that you can just be like, hey, I'm here, you're not going to necessarily be like trying to, it takes a long time to process, and people are at different stages of on that continuum of processing what happened to them, and they're not ready to see everything all at once. Even if they've left, they're not ready. A lot of times people leave and they still kind of know, they still sort of maybe believe like this is the prophet or this is a good thing, but they just have to leave. They know that intuitively that they're just going to literally die if they stay. So they've left and they feel like I'm just too weak to stay in that group. There's something wrong with me that I can't stay, that I can't keep working the same hours, that I can't keep being exposed to that abuse. It's just because they've been trained like that means you're just a weak person. And so they leave and they just think I'm just a weak person. I just couldn't do it. And I'm like destined to go to hell, but I can't do it anymore. And they're not in the stage of like really unpacking like this was not okay, this was abuse, this was a cult. They're not necessarily there yet. And you have to really be respectful of where people are along their stage. Healing just takes place in stages. It's not always linear.
Are
And
there kind of like, is there any sort of general guideline for like a timeline for healing or stages of that? I mean,
I
I
wish there
realize
was. I wish there
it's
was.
crazy.
I mean, it just depends on all of, I mean, I think you ask a bigger question of like, when do people, it just depends on like how extensive the abuse was that you personally experienced, how long you experienced it for, like what other kinds of, if somebody had like a really good, strong, healthy, just one person throughout their experience who they were able to have a real true relationship with, then that is going to be helpful in their healing, that they had that long, like, so I think sometimes like if you grew up in an abusive system and you have siblings who were really helpful for you, who like loved you and were there and witnessed the whole thing and you were able to go to, like that's going to be incredibly helpful in your healing and help healing to take a shorter amount of time. Like it just depends on a lot of factors and it's different for everybody. I think Dr. Lalich likes to say like a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. I mean, but it really just depends, right? And we're always going to be, and all of us are a position for just lifelong learning and lifelong healing, right?
Yeah, we
Um,
definitely talk about it being like peeling an onion. Like, I think we're
yeah,
just going to be healing from pieces of this forever. But I
yeah,
think all of us are going to be, whether we're cult survivors or not, we're
yeah.
all in the process of, like you
We're
said,
all
like,
in the process.
yeah,
Yeah. And a lot of it is like acceptance of yourself and not like, I think also noticing that this idea of like, I need to grow, I need to heal, I should,
hmm,
that kind of thinking kind of comes from the cult, right? Of like, there's always some better state that I need to reach. So
yes,
a lot of it is just radical self-acceptance of where you're at and who you are every day, like just learning to be accepting and loving and recognizing how far you already have come, recognizing all the resources, like just the internal resources that you have, like recognizing that like you did survive this and you are okay, you know, that acceptance is really key of yourself. So, what else did you want to ask?
I kind of just to finish,
Yeah.
when we talk about, somebody's gotten out, they they get that basic level of Maslow's needs, or the food and
Mm-hmm.
shelter and safety, and they realize like, I might need some help.
Mm-hmm.
How does a person um, go about finding the right therapist? And how, let's say the person finds someone and they they vibe with them, but
Hmm.
maybe they don't, that therapist doesn't really know a lot about cult psychology. How how can they advocate to their therapist
Yeah.
to pursue some extra training like at the Lawlich Center?
I mean, I think that's such a great question, and there's so many aspects to it. There are a lot of different self-help books that I would recommend survivors read that can help them with their experience, and they can read, the Lawlich Center has recommendations, certainly Take Back Your Life
Yeah.
is written by Dr. Yanya Lalich, and that is almost like a guidebook to, a lot of these things.
Yes.
She's also written Escaping Utopia, which is more about like growing up, the experiences of growing up, like not just joining a cult later in life, but actually growing up in one, and leaving and that whole process. And it's based on a whole bunch of different in-depth qualitative interviews with survivors. I would start with some different basic self-help books. Just the psychoeducation is so important, kind of just understanding what happened to you,
Yes.
and seeing it written down. Like you're hearing me talk about it and you're like, wow, this is crazy that it's so similar to my experience. And there is something that can be really healing and maybe sometimes, triggering too about like just reading like, wow, like this was written down. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like I'm not the only one that experienced these things.
Yes.
So common that somebody took the time to write it down. Like that in and of itself can be really healing and eye-opening. There can
Yes.
be support groups for people. There are a bunch of different organizations. There's the International Cultic Studies Association is a website, an organization you can go to, and you can find a lot of different resources for survivors, for concerned friends and family members, and it also has like a list of different therapists and support groups and resources. Therapy is just one part, like mental health therapy is just one part of the healing process, and so there are different like right,
Mhm.
like taking care of your basic needs, like I said, is really essential. Self-care is really, really
Mm.
important. And a lot of survivors of these groups almost saw self-care as like a self-indulgent, almost like sinful thing, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it can be really hard to just like let yourself have 8 hours of sleep at
Yeah.
night or like eat a good meal or just like have a morning where you don't get anything done, or where you just let yourself sleep in or whatever it is.
What?
You know,
That's crazy talk.
that could be really hard. But finding a therapist, I think, who is just sometimes takes several different tries. I mean, it's definitely really good to find somebody who does have some basic awareness of coercive control and abusive systems and religious and spiritual trauma. That's why at the Lawlich Center, we are trying to educate clinicians on this so that they have the basic awareness and skills and knowledge, so that they're not like accidentally saying the wrong thing. Although we always do as therapists, we're not perfect. Like, especially when you've been through an experience like this, I think
Yeah.
therapy just can be triggering in and of itself. And that's not necessarily a red flag. If you have a really good therapist, she can help navigate those
Yeah.
experiences in a therapeutic way. But yeah, having that basic cult education can be helpful, but even just as much, at least, if not more, is just a trauma-informed therapist, especially somebody who has extra training in working with survivors of any kind of abusive situation that has resulted in some kind of chronic interpersonal abuse that results sometimes in complex PTSD.
Mhm.
So that's almost as maybe more important than understanding having a knowledge of cults is having knowing how to work with people with complex PTSD and having really good skills for that. And that's something that this training really helps therapists to understand, to look out and kind of think about different ideas for treatment planning with complex PTSD. I would also say that for people who are, especially people who are on the earlier stages of recovering, you don't necessarily, a lot of people like have this idea of, oh, I need to do a specific trauma treatment. But when you're doing therapy for complex PTSD, if that's something that you happen to have, which a lot of cult survivors do have those types of clusters of symptoms,
Yep.
I will say that it's important to feel, to have a sense of safety in that room with your therapist to really feel like, okay, I feel more or less comfortable in the room. I feel like I can trust this therapist. I feel like this therapist lets me know, like I can ask her questions. I can tell her like what seems to be helping, what doesn't seem to be helping. She's really transparent about her or his scope of practice. She doesn't overpromise. I can ask her specific questions about treatment planning, and that's an important part of your healing, is to have that basic trust there
Yes.
and comfort. And she's really open to understanding my experience, and also that you don't necessarily like jump right into the trauma, that you're not necessarily jumping right into needing to say all the most horrific things that happened to you before you're feeling ready. Because with
Yes.
complex PTSD, there's a lot of stabilization and coping skills and feeling comfortable and feeling like you understand like the psychoeducation and just this, there should be a sense of stabilization and trust that can
Yes.
sometimes be the whole course of therapy. You might not even get to like the trauma processing yet with the first relationship that you have. So that's something else that I would say. And I really want to plug our class. It's called
Please.
it's called our the first class that we offer. It's called Working with Cult Survivors, a basic certification course for mental health clinicians. And it's an 8-hour CE course. The Lawlich Center is approved by the American Psychological Association to offer continuing education credits for psychologists, and often all sorts of other types of clinicians that will count for their like licensure renewal CE requirements that we have to do. As clinicians, we have to always
Yes.
be learning,
Yes.
learning new things. And so it's just an opportunity, and it's an asynchronous class that clinicians
Okay.
can take online, and it's self-paced,
Okay.
and it's very survivor centered. So we have a lot of, didactic content of me just talking at you. So, but like, because it's important to kind of know the basic psychology and all of the literature and the research. We have interviews with the expert, Dr. Janja Lalich, and we also have other, we've included the voices of many other experts too, who work for many years and are usually cult survivors themselves, talking
Okay.
about like different techniques. And we also have a bunch of interviews with survivors themselves,
Wow.
talking about their experience of therapy and what was helpful, what was not helpful.
And
And
that's all in that 8 hour,
it's
that
all
first
in the 8-hour
of that.
training that you can take online. And so I'll make sure to give you the link to the Lawlich Center and the link to that training. And you can ask your therapist, to take the training, or, to at least do, there's so many free resources that folks can get online, whether they're a clinician. The International Cultic Studies Association has like lots of free handbooks for
Yeah.
people who, for how to work with cult survivors, that sort of thing. So you don't have to necessarily pay to take a CE course, but it can be something that is an option for clinicians. And it's something that anybody can take, so you don't have to be
I
a
was gonna
clinician.
ask, like, if
Yeah,
just
yeah.
somebody wanted to.
It's the CE credit is just for, and the certification is just for clinicians, but it is, something that anybody can take.
Yes, I will, the Lawrence Center website, the links to those resources, they'll all be, you can find them right here in the podcast text. So that's
Terrific.
amazing.
Yeah.
I am so grateful to you, Dr. Faber, for shining all of this light and wisdom around high control groups. And thank you for walking us through what
Absolutely.
kind of goes into getting into, being in, and getting out of a
Yeah.
cult or a group with coercive control. I'm so grateful that the Lawlich Center and the work that you do is being offered to
Mhm.
professionals, because it's really needed.
Yeah.
And I think it's just so important for anybody listening today, if they're on this journey or they know someone who's on this journey, just to know that there's supports and resources and healing
Yes.
and people
Yes.
ready to walk.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm just so inspired by you and by the other survivors the other women that you had interviewed on this podcast. It's really takes a lot of courage to come out and share your stories in this vulnerable way. It takes so much courage to do that. And so I just very inspiring, what you put together here. And I know you've said that you never even heard a podcast before. You never even listened to one before doing,
Teaching myself.
and so it's truly a survivor-led project. And
Yes.
I know that you're learning as you go and everything, which is how life goes, right? And
I
project.
mean, I love the continuous learning, and I am
Yeah.
so, so incredibly proud of
Uh-huh.
my fellow survivors. They are warriors, and
Yes.
we're going to kind of launch back from your this podcast,
Yeah.
and coming up next are more survivor stories. But we
Yeah.
really wanted to share how this can happen,
Yes.
and what goes on, so
Absolutely.
that people listening will have a better understanding
Yeah.
of the survivors that are going to be sharing their stories over
Sure.
the next weeks and months. So
Yeah. And
this,
as you could probably tell, there's so much more to say about all of this. I think
I know, like
we
we should,
opened, yeah, we kind of opened up a lot of tabs that we didn't get to like
yeah,
fully read all the way through. And that's kind of how this work goes a little bit. I'd be very happy to come back on and like kind
would
of
love that.
follow through with some of the different threads.
Let's do
It's
that.
not something that can be explained in one podcast
No,
episode, of course.
no. But if
But
we can break down some of those pieces and just
yeah,
spend some focused time
yeah,
on, just those 8 sins, or
yes,
just, I think that
absolutely.
would be
Mhm.
amazing. Brought to you by Rock Harbor Truth. I'm your host, Bonnie Zampino. Thank you for listening as we continue telling the story of the cult on the Cape.